Warmonger Pelosi, get out of Taiwan. That's the message people visiting many of the 6,500 7-Eleven convenience stores in Taiwan saw on television screens behind cashiers on Wednesday, August 3, 2022, while U.S. House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi was visiting the island nation. But why would Taiwan send such a negative message to Pelosi, who just a day prior described her historic visit as honoring America's unwavering commitment to supporting Taiwan's vibrant democracy? The answer is simple: it didn't. The disturbing message came from another party, one that's no stranger to using any weapon in its arsenal to achieve its goals. The party in question is, of course, the People's Republic of China, or mainland China to be exact. Rather than bullets, shells, or grenades, China used a cyber attack to sow confusion, manipulate perception, and create chaos. You might think these and similar weapons are less effective than traditional military weaponry, but the truth is that these seemingly unconventional attacks can bring any country to heel by undermining its stability, destabilizing its institutions, and eroding the public's trust. China knows just how effective these so-called silent warfare tactics are. That's why they've become one of its top weapons of choice. And just as weapons have changed, so have war zones. Instead of battling it out on traditional battlefields, the wars of today are fought in the so-called gray zone. As you can probably guess, the gray zone is anything but black and white. Here, the boundaries of peace and conflict blur, allowing countries like China to thrive. After all, it's the same nation that can establish trade with virtually any country while simultaneously engaging in silent conflict with it. Given how well China navigates this gray zone, it shouldn't be surprising that the Eastern superpower wields a comprehensive toolkit of silent warfare tactics, using them either directly against the United States or against its allies, partners, and interests. One look at this toolkit reveals a wide range of tactics, from the aforementioned cyber attacks and information manipulation to somewhat bolder military provocations that stay just below the threshold of conventional war. With this in mind, let's have a closer look into this toolkit to understand why China's silent warfare tactics work as well as they do. We'll also examine what the U.S., as the primary target of these attacks, does to respond. Spoiler alert, the U.S.'s response has often been somewhat lacking. So we'll also explore what else it could do to stand up to one of the most audacious autocracies in the gray zone. But before diving in, let's hit the books and learn about war in the gray zone. We should probably define the concept of the gray zone and silent warfare tactics first. Do research on these warfare methods and the gray zone and you'll see a whole host of definitions. Some focus on how these tactics are designed to work gradually rather than produce immediate and conclusive results. Others point out that silent warfare is an alternative to traditional approaches to achieving political objectives, diplomacy, and an all-out war. Still, others focus on the covertness of it all. But no matter the exact wording these definitions use, they all agree on a few key principles in waging a war in the gray zone. Some might even surprise you if you think of the gray zone as a lawless land. 1. There are boundaries. They might not be crystal clear, but they definitely exist. Otherwise, the countries on the opposite sides of the conflict would slip into military confrontation in no time. Naturally, these boundaries depend on the exact country engaging in the silent warfare, but they are typically drawn just below the rival's escalatory bar. 2. There's always an objective. You might not see it right away, but it's there, lurking in the shadows. Of course, some objectives are ultra-specific and easily identifiable. Think of China's militarization of the South China Sea Islands. Others are more broad and veiled, making them hard to discern until it's too late and they've already done irreparable damage. 3. Boundaries might apply to the scope of operation, but certainly not to the weapons used. Remember, this isn't traditional warfare. No legal constraints are dictating their moves. In fact, in the gray zone, it's the more the merrier. Cyber attacks, disinformation, propaganda, social media manipulation, economic coercion, espionage, proxy warfare, you name it. And you can probably find examples of it being used in the gray zone, and more often than not used by China, as you'll soon see. The fourth common characteristic of gray zone warfare also pertains to boundaries, or rather lack thereof. There are no boundaries between a state-owned public enterprise or a private entity in the gray zone, and if there are, they're incredibly blurred. This means one thing: any organization is fair game. But let's go back to the gray zone toolkit we keep mentioning. What does China hide in there? Again, we use the word hide quite loosely here as well. Quite a lot, actually. However, we should also point out that China has decided not to take action in some areas of the gray zone. This is interesting, as it's certainly not due to a lack of capability. One plausible explanation is that China has felt deterred by U.S. actions, making the response of the world's #1 superpower that much more important. But we're not there yet. We'll discuss the US's appropriate response a bit later. Now it's time to open the Pandora's box that is China's Gray Zone toolkit. Let's get the boldest tactics out of the way first and work our way down. Perhaps we can even find some hope at the bottom. The first Gray Zone tactic China loves to employ is referred to as provocation by state-controlled forces. Though this tactic isn't the one favored by China, it is certainly the one that makes the most noise. It's also the one which has the world worried the most, fearing the day it pushes the boundaries just an inch too far, thus crossing the gray zone into open conflict. But let's back up. What are these "there might be a World War III soon" provocations we're talking about? Provocation by state-controlled forces is exactly as it sounds. It's the use of state-funded, non-military and paramilitary forces to achieve an objective. If you know anything about China's history and present, you can probably already list at least a few examples of this tactic off the top of your head. First up, sending a message by missile. From 1995 to 1996, the People's Republic of China carried out a series of missile tests in the waters surrounding Taiwan, causing the Third Taiwan Strait crisis. These incessant tests were a response to the then president of Taiwan, Lee Teng-hui, accepting an invitation from his alma mater, Cornell University, to deliver a speech on the region's democratization experience. These missile drills and similar military exercises are among China's most frequently used tactics, especially when it comes to Taiwan. In fact, they were used again just a few months after the Cornell visit to intimidate voters ahead of the 1996 Taiwanese presidential election. Next up, a fishing boat. Yep, you heard that right. Besides missiles, China has traditionally relied on this seemingly much less scary object, or dozens of them to be precise, to achieve its goals. Though the choice might seem odd, these fishing boats have actually been quite effective in preventing the Philippines from accessing territorial waters and disrupting commercial activities in a sea through which $5 trillion in goods are shipped every year. These activities resulted in several incidents, most prominent among them being the 2012 Scarborough Shoal standoff. Interestingly, China claims no responsibility for these boats, maintaining that the vessels are enforcing the law on their own. And why wouldn't we believe China? It's not like its president promised to not militarize the South China Sea only to do just that a few years down the road. China started its island-building activities in the South China Sea, arguably the country's most prominent Gray Zone campaign, in 2013. Since then, it's elevated more than 3,200 acres of new land out of the sea. But considering everything, how have these militarization activities gone off without a hitch? With a little help from the Chinese Coast Guard and the People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia, or PAFM, of course. So we've had missiles and we've had boats. What's next on the roster? It's aircraft. From September 2020 to August 21, at least 554 People's Liberation Army aircraft crossed into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone. This staggering figure was increased by another 1,100 aircraft patrolling around Taiwan in August and September 2022. These air operations have the same purpose as China's maritime operations: to verify Taiwan's military capability, test its response, and, let's be frank, provoke the US. But the 2022 trouble didn't stop there. Following Pelosi's Taiwan visit, China retaliated for the perceived US provocation by conducting another series of military exercises around Taiwan, but this time it even crossed the Taiwan Strait's median line, thus creating a new status quo. Of course, China's response to the ensuing criticism was to deny a median line even exists. Go figure. If you think 2023 brought some respite, we got bad news. China's Gray Zone activities would only continue and seemingly intensify in 2023. In this year alone, 2 undersea cables connecting Taiwan's Matsu Island to the internet were mysteriously cut. A military-grade laser was shown at a Philippine Coast Guard, temporarily blinding a part of its crew, and a resupply Philippine ship was rammed by a Chinese Coast Guard vessel. No wonder some experts consider the South China Sea the most dangerous place in the world. Before our hopes for stability sink into that same sea, let's move on to a less aggressive tactic in China's Gray Zone toolkit: disinformation. But keep in mind, when we say less aggressive, we only mean it physically. As you'll soon hear, these tactics can be as destructive as misguided military forces, just in their own way. So how does China use disinformation to further its goals? Well, China treats disinformation as an effective tool to influence perceptions both domestically and internationally. The channels used for these efforts are numerous, from state-owned television to social media networks. The objectives of these campaigns are also numerous, but they also share a common goal: to sow doubt and dissent. The textbook example of this tactic includes the Chinese spokesperson Zhu Fenglian's claim that the U.S. plans to abandon Taiwan and evacuate its citizens after turning the island into a minefield and ammunition depot. Though you might take one look at the claim and see right through it, not all people will do the same. In fact, polls have shown that Chinese disinformation tactics have been rather successful in swaying the opinion of Taiwanese people about the U.S. But if you've been paying attention so far, you probably won't be surprised to learn that China doesn't stop at spreading disinformation. It also strives to legitimize its outlandish claims via various information strategies. Take the highly contentious 9-line map. This map, demarcating China's ownership over the South China Sea, may have been rejected by the International Court of Justice in The Hague in 2016, but this doesn't stop the country from trying to legitimize its claim over the area whenever it gets a chance to. In 2019, the map could be seen in the animated film Abominable, while in 2023 it was placed in the global phenomenon known as the Barbie movie, which topped $1 billion in box office ticket sales. Talk about exposure. Unfortunately, we can't stay in Barbie land for much longer, so our next stop is the very real and much less fun world of the global economy. In other words, we've reached another favorite of China's gray zone toolkit: economic coercion. China treats its enormous economic influence as a tool to coerce other nations into compliance. The goal, or should we say goals, of this tactic is to either accomplish national economic objectives or harm those of a perceived adversary. To achieve these goals, China is ready to do virtually anything. Anything includes imposing trade sanctions, restricting market access, and conducting industrial espionage. But the two most prominent examples of China's economic coercion are undoubtedly President Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative and the Digital Silk Road Initiative. The former is a vast infrastructure and economic development project aiming to connect China with countries across Asia, Europe, and beyond. While China presents this project as a means of fostering economic cooperation and development, many countries see it as a one-way ticket to debt dependency for the participating nations. The latter tackles the digital realm, investing in telecommunications infrastructure, technology projects, and digital services. This immediately raises two red flags. 1. Imagine putting all your data in the hands of a country that's not exactly shy about exerting control over information. And 2. This project would make it easy for China to coerce a hosting nation into virtually anything by, for example, simply threatening to turn off its telecommunications infrastructure. Given China's history with retaliation, this scenario is very likely. Let's go back to information control for a second, as it also has to do with another tactic found in China's gray zone toolkit: cyber operations. This tactic applies China's whatever-it-takes approach to cyberspace, where whatever it takes might include the use of malware, viruses, and hacking to achieve various goals. These include conducting information warfare to disrupt political processes and punishing perceived enemies, as we just mentioned. Though Chinese cyber attacks can target virtually any country, there's one country that has seemingly taken the brunt of these malicious actions, especially since 2014. Give you 3 guesses who. You probably only need one. It's the US. And that's why the US Cyber Command was elevated to a combatant command in 2018. This organization has also expanded dramatically and now has over 2,000 active service members and as many as 133 cyber teams. Still, aggressive cyber attacks on the US public and private sector organizations continue. Out of hundreds of global organizations targeted in the 2021 security breach carried out by state-backed Chinese hackers, 55% were from the Americas. Besides the US, Taiwan is another frequent target of Chinese cyber attacks, some of which have specific goals, such as the 7-Eleven video hack that targeted Pelosi, while others only seek to create chaos and disrupt the cohesion of the Taiwanese society. Now it's time to leave cyberspace and travel to actual space. The gray zone on Earth apparently wasn't big enough for China, so it had to expand its activities to space as well. When it comes to space operations as part of a gray zone toolkit, the tactics involve disrupting competitors' regular space and space-enabled activities by targeting their equipment, communications, or data. To this end, China's deployed military-grade jamming equipment on islands in the South China Sea, targeted U.S. satellites through cyber attacks, and pushed the development of laser weapons used to temporarily or permanently damage satellite sensors. By now, it's probably crystal clear that China can wreak some serious havoc on a variety of fronts, from a vast sea to the expanse of outer space. But how has China been able to pull off all these intricate and potentially destabilizing maneuvers? It appears the answer to this question may come down to simple authoritarianism. First and foremost, China feels right at home in the gray zone. For the US and most of the West, things are usually exclusively black and white. We're either at peace or at war. In China, however, ambiguity reigns supreme. The Asian superpower has no problem selling you electronics one day and then using those products to spy on your activities the very next. As a result, China excels at these less than warlike activities, unlike the US. Speaking of the US, its laser focus on traditional warfare has also contributed to China's dominance in the gray zone. After seeing it couldn't compete on a physical battlefield, China refocused its activities to the less direct but just as effective field, the gray zone. This move was greatly influenced by the success of these types of tactics by China's fellow authoritarian friend, Russia, who's also a familiar face in the gray zone. These two nations might have slightly different playbooks and toolkits, but they excel at using them just the same, especially as they normally employ these tactics against democracies. By their very nature, democracies are rather open and transparent, making them highly vulnerable to manipulation. In addition, it can be a challenge to get a democratic nation to agree on using a gray zone tactic against another country, while China has practically ingrained such methods as doctrine. In other words, to match China's efforts in this regard is to drift away from democracy. But don't get it twisted, these limitations don't mean the US will simply stand by and watch as China runs rampant in the gray zone. Let's explore how and how well the US responds to China's gray zone tactics. Since these tactics almost exclusively target the US and its allies, the first step in countering them is recognizing they're taking place. This is done through security information indicators and warnings. However, the US's thresholds for warning policymakers about these tactics must be further adjusted to account for their slow burn, deceptive, and non-military nature. Once they are, the US will be able to implement effective policies dictating when and how to react to a perceived gray zone tactic. One of the possible reactions is to issue a public warning, as President Joe Biden did after the second Thomas Shoal dispute in 2023. President Biden stated, "Any attack on Filipino aircraft vessels or armed forces will invoke our mutual defense treaty with the Philippines." A similar message was delivered directly to the Philippines, reassuring the US's commitment to protecting its ally against China's gray zone advances. But in the gray zone, actions speak louder than words. And unfortunately, the US's reactions to China's tactics are often late or lacking. Even with a prior warning, as was the case with China's land reclamation in the South China Sea, the US seemingly struggles to decide how to respond. Of course, this is a bad sign in any geopolitical context, but with gray zone tactics it can be detrimental. Why? Well, when it comes to these tactics, it's all about who moves first. Had the US contested the artificial islands in the South China Sea, it might have been able to stop them from turning into impressive military and intelligence bases. Even significantly smaller moves that go unnoticed or unpunished can signal that the US is fine with moving the previously set boundaries. Once this happens, shifting those boundaries back becomes nearly impossible, especially when each subsequent response is typically weaker than the initial attack. But if the US doesn't go directly on the offensive, what should it do to protect the interests in the face of gray zone challenges? Well, for starters, the US could work effectively on rallying its sources of soft power in the face of gray zone tactics. After all, something has to be done with all the cultural sway, economic reach, and information tools this country wields. The US should also adopt a campaign mindset, recognizing that the struggle in the gray zone might be constant and without clear-cut victories the country is used to. Above all, it's crucial for the US to fully understand its capabilities and the sheer scope of its strategic advantages to allow it to counter gray zone threats, no matter how nuanced or insidious they may be. To help you understand the potential the US has in combating gray zone tactics successfully, let's explore some of these strategic advantages comprising both soft and hard power. The US's first line of defense against gray zone challenges should be its unwavering commitment to the rule of law, protection of minorities, and individual rights and freedoms. This factor alone should be enough to empower the US to take prompt action when faced with a gray zone threat. The same goes for the vibrancy and reach of the US in science, art, entertainment, and media sectors. It can get pretty tricky to economically coerce a country that works with the US closely and thus has access to everything this powerful ally has to offer. Another crucial defense the US has to offer is a free and fair press. The importance of this strategic advantage against China's spread of disinformation simply can't be understated. Though disinformation tends to prey upon existing divisions within a country, a free and fair press serves as a potent tool for debunking false narratives, providing accurate information, and making the public more informed about what's really going on. But as powerful as it is, the US can't do it alone. especially when facing several adversaries who've mastered gray zone warfare, including China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Luckily, the US doesn't have to fly solo on this. It's been shown time and time again that most nations prefer having the US as the world's leading power. This, of course, includes its many alliances and partner networks that can help establish a collective front against gray zone threats. This front should have a single goal: stopping China's advances without turning the gray zone into a bloody battlefield. Unfortunately, that's easier said than done, as China's been ramping up its silent warfare tactics to the point that they can no longer be described as silent. That's why the US and its allies should also ramp up their ability to respond to these challenges, because as tricky as they are, they're infinitely better than a full-on conflict. What do you think? Do you think the US will be able to keep up with and confront China's evolving silent warfare tactics successfully? If not, how far do you think China is willing to go? Sound off in the comments below. Now watch why China's artificial islands are now sinking, or check out what would happen if China and the US went to war hour by hour.